Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and Suspense Shorts in the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And you can find out more about me at mattydalrymple.com and at theindyauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions about their latest book. What did they learn from their latest book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn from their latest book they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And I am joined today by David Jacinto. Hey, David, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Matty. Thank you so much for inviting me. Appreciate it.
I am happy to have you here. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, David A. Jacinto was born into a family living on the wrong side of the tracks and has been a storyteller ever since. He was the first in his extended family to attend college, receiving his degree in civil engineering. He went on to serve as president of SM Engineering Company and held leadership roles in multiple national and international companies. And his latest book is Out of the Darkness. And so today I am asking David the first question about Out of the Darkness, which is, what did you learn from the book that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Well, I have to say, writing a book like this, which is a novel of 400 pages, is a long process. So the first advice I would give is to be passionate about your subject. I learned about the folks that are in this book, and this novel is about real people and real events. And I've made a fictional study of their interpersonal relationships. But I received a call from my mom a few years ago when she was sick with cancer. She was living in Louisiana, and I was here in San Diego. And I'd just written a book called Christmas Kindling, which was a compilation of several short Christmas stories. It wasn't going to be out for a couple of months, and she was sick with cancer and asked if I might read her some of the stories. Well, we were a long way apart, so I hopped on a plane and flew to Louisiana and spent 8 days with her. The first day, we read 2 stories, and she was fascinated by these stories. And I learned a little bit about her family that I hadn't known before. She was an orphan, and I hadn't known about her birth family. She told me about a family in Wyoming that was her birth family, and quite a bit that I didn't know anything about. So for the next 7 days, I read 2 stories a day to finish all 16 stories of Christmas Kindling. And shortly after I finished, she passed away with cancer. We buried her in Wyoming, which is what she had requested, in this family's plot. I'd never been to this little town before, but wandering around this cemetery, which was a couple hundred years old, I found the largest 2 tombstones in the entire cemetery were my great-great-great-grandparents. I had never heard a word about them before, except during that week with my mom. So I was fascinated. But Wyoming's not that far from Salt Lake City. So my wife and I drove down that Saturday morning to Salt Lake City and spent the rest of the day in the genealogical library there, which is the largest in all the world. And we researched this family and found a lot of fascinating things about his time, both in England and in America. This fellow, Thomas Wright, had a fascinating life and experienced some great tragedies in his life that helped him shape not only his life, but laws in England were changed as a result of it. He interrelated with a young Queen Victoria in 1837, and it was a wonderful story. But to answer more of your question, having passion about your subject is so important. I spent 2.5 years studying this family, and at the end, I couldn't do anything but write a story. I spent almost 2 years writing the 2-book series, the first, while their time in England, and the second in America. But I had written a book before, but it was more of telling stories about Christmas events. This book is a novel. I needed to learn more about how to write a novel. So I spent quite a bit of time reading other books that helped me in that regard. I read one, which I would suggest, is called Save the Cat. It's written by a fellow who helps screenwriters write books. And it goes through a series of steps that any writer of a novel or screenwriter should go through when they write a novel. There's 15 steps roughly, and it takes you through these 15 steps that virtually every novel and every good writing author uses to engage the viewer and engage the reader. And so I did my best and outlined the entire book with these 15 points. And it changed as I went along, but I wrote different scenes within that book at different times. So I didn't necessarily start from the beginning and go all the way through the end. I actually wrote the end of the book, the last several scenes, about halfway through the book, and then had to go back and change a lot of the previous scenes to mesh together. And it was a back and forth process all the way through. Although I have to say, writing that summary was a very, very valuable tool for me. And it might be different for other writers. I am an engineer by training after all. So I approach problems like this methodically.
Well, it's interesting that you had this personal research activity, which I can imagine might have been very satisfying even if you had decided not to make a book out of it. And then also the book structure that you were trying to fit it into, was it challenging to mesh those two things?
Well, it was challenging, and you're right. It was fascinating. I spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon at the Genealogical Library in Salt Lake sitting in front of a computer with all these little old ladies huddled around me, fascinated by the story and learning along with me. We spent 4 or 5 hours, and I was so fascinated by the time I got done that the very next day, in fact, I went back to that little town. It was a Sunday, and we were flying out to San Diego on a Sunday afternoon. So I had quite a bit of time. So we drove back up to this little town, which is above Park City. And the only thing open on this little town on this particular Sunday was the church. So I went into the church and I spoke to the bishop there, and he said, "You're in luck because the historical director for our county and this area is a member of our congregation. She's not active, but I have her phone number and here it is." So I called her on the phone, and she was very interested in what I was telling her. And so on that day, she agreed to go down to the county building, open it up, and we spent 4 hours in the historical library there going through books, journals, letters, and a whole myriad of things. She was so fascinated that she worked with me for that 2.5 years and later invited me up to her house for dinner after I'd actually finished the draft on the second book. And she had researched where they ended up in this little town in Wyoming. Now, remember, this family grew up as coal miners in a 10 by 12 miner shanty. At 7 years old, the main character went into the mines 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He never saw sun in the morning, and he never saw sun in the evening. The only day he saw sun was on Sunday. That was his experience in England before getting involved to oppose child labor and working with Queen Victoria. When he came to America through a whole series of events, which I won't go into here, he ended up with 160 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen in your life. I stood there with my wife in the area in which his land was. And at the time, when we were there, it probably didn't look that much different than it did 150 years ago. But I didn't know exactly where it was. As we were looking at this land, I remember telling my wife, wouldn't it be amazing if this was the property where he ended up? And as I said that, she looked at a street sign up there, and the name on the street sign was Spring Hollow, which doesn't mean a thing to you, but in book 1 of this 2-book series, it's a very, very important part of the book. So he obviously named that area, and they had just remodeled a historical building on the property that was built when he was there. I knew nothing about this.
Oh my
I don't
goodness. That's one
maybe that
serendipity after the other.
maybe that's book 3,
Yeah.
but it was fascinating to me. And when we had dinner, she came back to that spot, took us back and we spent an hour there, and she took us through this historical monument or historical home. They actually had some folks living in it, but they have a big monument sign out in the front about their renovation and and who owned it. It was fascinating.
That's so cool. Well, it's fun to hear all the serendipitous events that led to your writing of the book. So, how about from a reader perspective? What did you learn from Out of the Darkness that you would like to share with your fellow readers?
Well, again, I think to make it interesting to a reader, it has to be fascinating. I mean, it's one thing to have relatives who had experiences in their lives, but most people, most readers are not particularly interested in reading those stories without the emotional content between the characters. So I think it's important here that the reader understand that historical events are interesting, but historical relationships between people are absolutely fascinating. And I tried my best. There are several other books that I read in writing this book to bring the reader into the lives of these people. In this book, there are several characters that I've noted that folks who have read the book find interesting. Matter of fact, the book is released tomorrow to the public on Amazon and every other fine bookstore around the country. But we had about 50 books that are called galleys, which are given out to the media. And of those books, several of them were read by friends and family and others who were just interested. And I was very careful to listen to what they had to say about characters. And I was surprised. Some of the characters that they're most interested in are not the primary characters, they're secondary characters, but because they touch something in their own lives, the reader's own lives, they relate to those characters. One, for example, is the mother of the boy who becomes the success story all the way through. And she is a fascinating character in that she was sold herself as a 6-year-old into servitude for a large home. In this book, there is a fellow named Lord Fitzwilliam who owns a 255,000 square foot home. That home is now a museum in England. She worked in that home as a maid and learned how to read and became passionate about it and is focused throughout this book on having her children be something besides a coal miner. And so they're all very voracious readers, and they accomplish great things in the UK and in the United States. One becomes a journalist here at the Chicago Tribune, and another we just talked about becomes very successful here, works on the Transcontinental Railroad all the way to Promontory Point. But I think from a reader's standpoint, a book is not interesting to most people if you don't relate to the characters, if you don't relate to the people that you're reading about. And so I tried my best to make sure that the characters were very relatable, as well as the story being fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, that's great advice, not only for readers, but also for your fellow writers as well. Great tip. So, David, it's been so nice talking to you. Please let our viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and Out of the Darkness online.
Well, right now, the book is released tomorrow on Amazon and wherever fine books are sold. If you go on Amazon, you can learn a little bit more about where you can find me. I've written 3 books now, and I hope to write more. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Congratulations on the launch of the book. We're recording this October 2nd, so the book is launching on October 3rd. And it was so interesting to hear the background of Out of the Darkness, David. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it, Maddie.